question, which is, who do you think is the hero or are the heroes of the Exodus story? Just to take the pulse of the room. Yes. So Miriam is the hero because of her foresight in terms of keeping families together, even during a time of enslavement. Of course, you are hearkening to the midrashic, to the homiletical understanding that the men and the women separated because they said, hey, what's the point? All the baby boys are being killed. And Miriam said, what do you mean, what's the point? Baby girls, that's the point, right? So from the very beginning, she had her eye on the long term, on the marathon, as opposed to the sprint. Great. Any other heroes of the Exodus narrative? Moses is the hero because he's what we call the stitcher, right? God, the Jewish people, they need someone to bridge that gap. Without Moses, the two would never meet, so to speak. Beautiful. Yes. Excellent.
Asking the question of the role of leadership.
Excellent question. She says, wait a minute, maybe your question is wrong, which is, why are you looking for a hero specifically? Because would we not have made it out without the heroes? Can I turn your question on its head and suggest that maybe the people are the heroes? That's actually the way that the political philosopher Michael Walzer reads it. He actually connects this to liberation theology being sort of the sense of the lowest class kind of rising up and creating a new and better society. It was very prominent in Latin American Catholic circles. In his book, Exodus as Revolution, he talks about the Jewish people as the heroes. And in fact, you might argue, well, actually, you don't really find the other heroes in the Haggadah. You don't really find them at the Passover Seder. Where is Moses? Where is Miriam? Where is Aaron? Are we trying to make sure that they don't overshadow the true heroes of the story? Great. I'm going to take one more. Yes, Pam. Pharaoh's daughter is the hero of the story. She saved, wow. You wouldn't have a Moses. I will tell you something. The verse that I referred to when we were in the other room, Vatakam be'od laila, she got up while it was still night. The Midrash, the rabbinic homilies say that refers to the daughter of Pharaoh. When it was still night for the Jewish people, she got up and did something salvific. She did something to save. By the way, I'm surprised that no one said God was the hero. Just I know we're very postmodern and everything, but God got some short shrift there, right? Because that's another way you might argue that the human heroes, individual human heroes, are not in there so that God, the hero, also stands out, right? Ani velo malach, I and not an angel. Ani velo saraf, and I and not a seraph, as it says in the Passover Haggadah. Well, even though I think I agree with this woman in the back that looking for heroes or looking for a hero in a huge story like this, I think is a mistake, because we're really looking at a matrix of heroes, right? God as the hero, the people as heroes, the daughter of Pharaoh as heroes, Miriam as heroes, Aaron as hero, Moses as hero. There are so many heroes in this story. And essentially the story becomes not about heroism, but about commitment of the average person. But I was asked to talk about leadership and Passover. So I said, you know what? We're going to talk about leadership and Passover and not talk specifically about the Haggadah, but I think this can be very relevant to your Passover Seder nonetheless. I want to look at two people, two market heroes in our story, Moses and Miriam. And in some ways, I want to foil them against each other, but in some ways, I just want to appreciate each of them on their own. Now, Moses, if you want to talk about Moses, you see this picture, Charlton Heston, Moses? He comes with me to my Seder every year. I kid you not. I have a postcard exactly this postcard, laminated, that comes to the Seder every year because I say Moses is not in the Passover Seder. I have to bring him to the Passover Seder, so I do. But this iconic picture is actually very telling in certain ways because we look at Moses as this figure on the mountain, figure of perfection. And I saw something for the first time that I have to tribute my father-in-law with sending me. I have the blessing of being in a family with many rabbis. My brother-in-law's a rabbi, my husband's a rabbi, my father-in-law's a rabbi, my brother's a rabbi. We have too many rabbis in the family, one might say. So we all share material. So my father-in-law sent me this unbelievable piece that you can read in number 1, and we're going to read it together. Rabbi Israel Lipschitz, he was a really interesting, forward-thinking, interested in science and Judaism in the 19th century in Danzig, okay? So he kind of had a sense of secular culture and Jewish and really deep Jewish learning. And he brings this story as a commentary to actually a Mishnah at the end of Tractate Kiddushin. A Mishnah that says, Tov sheberofim legehinom, the best of doctors. Anyone here a doctor? Good. The best of doctors, actually, that's really not good. I would like to have a doctor in the room. The best of doctors goes to Gehenna, okay? Goes to hell, okay? That's not a comment on your particular medical provider. That is simply what the Mishnah says, and he gives this as a commentary on it. And I'll tell you why later, but what's important is the commentary. Take a look at number 1, okay? Moses' leadership from a different perspective than we've ever thought about it before, I think. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, the nations heard, they trembled, as is written in Exodus 15:14. They were particularly curious about Moses, the man through whom all these marvelous deeds had transpired. So much so that an Arabian king sent a gifted artist to the Israelite encampment with orders to paint a portrait of the Israelite leader and to return with it to Arabia. The artist went, painted the portrait, and brought it to the king. The king then sent for his physiognomists. His physiognomists, of course, who were going to say, well, his forehead is this big, and therefore it tells you this about him, and his nose is this big, right? God bless us all. Jewish noses must say something positive, I hope. And ordered them to prepare an analysis of Moses' character, virtues, and strengths based upon his facial features as reflected in the portrait. The physiognomists complied with the king's orders and reported as follows. If we are to render judgment solely on the basis of the facial features of this portrait, we must report, O king, that despite the distinguished reputation, he is entirely wicked, arrogant, greedy, capricious, and indeed suffused with every known vice. Upon hearing the analysis, the king was livid. You're sporting with me, he cried out. From every corner of the globe, I have heard the opposite regarding this great man. The physiognomists and the artists were seized with fright. They responded to the king pusillanimously, each accusing the other of incompetence. The artists claimed that the portrait was executed with precision, but it was the physiognomists who had erred in their interpretation of the portrait. And of course, the physiognomists in turn blamed the artists, claiming the portrait was obviously inaccurate. The king, determined to resolve the matter, set off on his chariot to a state visit, accompanied by his troops to the Israelite camp. Okay, so the king of Arabia wants to see this man for himself. Go see Moses. Upon sighting Moses, the man of God, from a distance, he took out the portrait, gazed at it and at Moses, and knew at once that the artist's depiction had been executed with precision. The king was down before him and related the entire story to him. He concluded his remarks as follows. Before I gazed upon your face, O man of God, I suspected that the artist had been incompetent. For the physiognomists now I know are at fault. They have deceived me. Their wisdom comes to naught. I have been supporting them even as they misled me with their nonsense. So he says to Moses essentially, obviously this is what you look like. The physiognomists were obviously wrong in their interpretation. Moses, the man of God, replied, not so. Indeed, the artists and the physiognomists are exceedingly competent and wise. Know that if I were naturally virtuous, I would be no more deserving of praise than a block of wood. For it too has no human faults. I'm not ashamed to admit, however, that I am naturally inclined to all the vices listed by the physiognomists, and then some. With great effort and determination, I overcame my inclinations until their very opposites became second nature to me. That is how I earned the glory that I now enjoy in heaven above and on earth below. What do you think? True story? Where did he find this? He says, I found this written somewhere. Where did he find this story? You think this was very popular after he gave this interpretation? No. He was lambasted by everyone and his brother, literally. Who does this Rabbi Lipschitz think he is, talking about Moses like this? He made this up. He found this in a pagan source. This is not a Jewish source that he found this in. What is he talking about? And literally there were calls for his commentary to the Mishnah, where this story is found, to be boycotted. The more moderate calls were to censor that part out. And I actually was worried when I was looking for the Hebrew, which I did find, but I didn't want your source sheet to be 8 pages long. When I was looking for the Hebrew, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to find it because I thought it would be censored out. But it's there. It's easy to find, actually. It's very easy to find. What do you think of this portrait of Moses in terms of what it says about leadership? Or his leadership, yeah. She says isn't that what leadership is? Leadership is not someone who's perfect or who starts out perfect. Leadership is someone who works on themselves. And not only that, is not ashamed to admit that they work on themselves. Anyone disagree? Because I'm going to play devil's advocate if you don't. I'm going to actually play it a different way, which is I'm not really sure that I want my leader to be somebody who has all of the vices. Have like 3 of the vices. And all of the vices, that's a lot of vices. And then some. That's a lot. I'm also going to ask you the following question, which is, do you think that the way that Moses describes himself, and feel free to look back at that paragraph, the way that Moses describes himself in this story, is he relatable? Is he a relatable character? Do you find him more relatable because of this or less relatable because of this? At first blush, I would say, makes it more relatable. But I want to read these words to you. The words are, I overcame my inclinations until their very opposites became second nature to me. How many of us can do that? I can struggle and sometimes fall back. But he's been able to actually change his vices into virtues. Correct. But what's the question? The question is not, does that make Moses a great leader? It clearly does. The question is, can I then relate? Can I say, well, I'm going to be able to do that same thing? And that's an important question to ask, right? Somebody who sort of is able to do it all, and then you say, well, I really want to be like that person, and then when I can't do it all, but I only come to here, is that, what do I do to fill that gap, right? So I want to show you sort of the best parts of being able to admit fault and being able to work on them, and also sometimes the difficulty in relating. And that's going to relate, right, to what we're going to do in a few minutes. But that's not to say anything but positive about Moses, but in terms of Moses as the stitcher, right? If God and the people, where is Moses closer to, right? He starts off as closer to the people, but right, he's moving closer to God because he has this sort of perfection of being able to overcome everything, right? You see what I'm trying to say? I need to tell you, by the way, that you know where this originates? This is fantastic. Professor Sid Lyman has a fabulous article on this. If you look at number 2, and we're not going to read it because it's not germane right now, but it originates with a story about Plato that you find in Cicero before the Common Era. That Cicero writes about Plato, that Plato had all of basically the same story. And in the Middle Ages, it actually became about Aristotle because everyone loved Aristotle in the Middle Ages. And you find it actually in some Jewish sources being about Aristotle. And then by the 19th century, he had heard it from some Hasidic sects that it was about Moses, right? So it's kind of an interesting, appropriation of what went on there. But I love this portrait of Moses for a number of reasons, right? One is because we know that we want a leader, and we want leaders who can admit that they have difficulties. But we also know that Moses stands out in the Jewish tradition as, wow, right? The sort of unattainable, the unattainable. And what does that kind of leadership mean? We need that kind of leadership, but for some people, they need a different kind of leadership. And how does that work? So I want to take this sort of, even though it's anachronistic and we're going back and forth with different eras, the point is to paint a picture, actually. So I want to use this as background in a way to compare the songs of Moses and Miriam at the sea, at the Red Sea, okay? And see kind of what emerges from that. So we're in number 3, Exodus 15, because here we actually have an ability to foil Moses with someone, right? There's actually someone who's doing the same thing as he is. He does a song, and then Miriam does a song. So you're able to see, let's try to pick it apart a little bit. So let's read it together in number 3. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spoke, saying, I will sing unto the Lord. For he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. 2. The Lord is my strength and song, and he is become my salvation. This is my God, and I will glorify him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. I stopped there, even though another 16 verses continued the song. Miriam's song is much shorter. Verse 20. And Miriam the prophetess, sister of Aaron, took essentially a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dances. And Miriam sang unto them, and I want you to keep in your mind verses 1 and 2 to start paralleling. Sing ye to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Right? It's very similar to Moses's, right? He says, I will sing unto the Lord. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. Also, basically the end of verse 1. That's her whole song. Let's pause there. That's her whole song. That's it. The next verse, one moment, the next verse, and Moses led Israel onward from the Red Sea, etc., etc. So there are those who suggest, actually Dr. Erica Brown has an interesting suggestion, that Moses interrupted her song. Meaning that she was singing, and he said, we have to get out of the Red Sea. This is dangerous. Like, we can't just continue to sing, right? But that I just thought was an interesting read. It's not necessarily the way that I read it, especially because you have that little S in the English, or that little samach in the Hebrew, which indicates a break when you look at a Torah scroll. So it's almost like she had her finality and she finished what she was saying. So talk to me about the difference or the similarities between these two texts. Yes. Right. That is true. He says, Ashira, I will sing. And she says, Shiru, you sing. Not only that, but regarding Moses, it says, as Yashir Moshe Uvnei Israel. Moses sang singular, and so did the children of Israel. Okay, very interesting. What else? Yes? The women followed Miriam. That is true. There's a very clear, Pied Piper effect.
It doesn't indicate that anyone followed Moshe.
Well, it says he sang and they sang. But it certainly doesn't give you that sense of like the hordes of people following. Yes?
I am struck by the fact that she is referred to as Aaron's sister, but not Moses's.
Right? Is the text trying to tell you something about she and Moses being different? And maybe she being a little bit more like Aaron, right? Of course, the Midrash, the rabbis interpret that this is actually referring to her original salvific perspective when she was just the sister of Aaron and she saw that little Moses born and said, hey, everybody, we have to save that kid, right? But there's another way to read it, which is Moses, Miriam, and Aaron. And I, by the way, specifically did not include Aaron in this morning's sort of foiling for two reasons. The first is Aaron's story is a lot more intensive, and his interactions with Moses, there are so many more that are about more than just the Exodus that I didn't feel I could do it justice in this short amount of time. And rather than bite off more than I could chew, I'd rather send people home with, there's more to chew on. I'd like to chew on more, right? So that's my perspective. Anything else? If you were a slave in Egypt, how well do you think you knew biblical poetry? Probably not so well. Right, so Moses has 16 more verses of biblical poetry. She has music. Did they probably know how to bang a tambourine? Clearly they did. They ran out after her, and they did. There's something of the people about her. And emotional. Exactly, and emotional. It's really quite fascinating. Any others before we go? Yes? Wait, time out. She started in defense of Moses. I want to point something out. I am totally value neutral about this. I realize that 21st century, everybody wants to be of the people and don't be elitist. Da, da, da. Guess what? Sometimes we need people who are elite to show us something incredible. Have you seen The Incredibles? I have a 3-year-old son. You have to see The Incredibles. I have a 3-year-old son. Mr. Incredible comes home. I hope you're holding your thought. Mr. Incredible comes home, And he stands in the driveway, and this man is a big man, and he's very strong. I should get a commission for this. He closes the door of his car after a long day, and there's this little kid sitting on a tricycle in his driveway. He says, "Kid, what are you waiting here for?" He says, "I'm waiting for something amazing," right? These people, maybe there's something amazing. Now, of course, without doing hero worship and thinking that they're perfect, right? But that's important. Yes. Maybe the people separated themselves from Moses. Very interesting, because you're saying, when we first meet Moses, what do you mean? He goes out to the people to see them, and he saves somebody who's getting beaten, right? Not only that, at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people say, we don't want to hear from God. The Israelites say, we don't want to hear from God. We want to hear from you, Moses. So there clearly is a kinship. This is not something where they felt that he was totally inaccessible, right? That doesn't mean that he isn't of a greater stature in some way than they are. And they might know it, okay, in a good way, and sometimes in a difficult way, right? Sometimes in a conflicting way. Great. So let's move on to Miriam for a moment, okay? Let's move on to Miriam for a moment. Now that we've used the foil of who's kind of more sort of part of the people, so to speak, and who's more of the outside model in some way, let's talk a little bit about Miriam, okay? Let's talk a little bit about that model of a person who's a leader, who's very much of the people, who doesn't appear as perfect. Let's talk about some of the difficulties sometimes of that model. I want to show you that when we encounter Miriam, whether we encounter her in good moments or in her difficult moments in her own life, there's something tumultuous about it, always, okay? Take a look, for example, in the verses that we were just reading in Exodus 15 to continue the verses. Miriam has just sung her song. Pasuk Kafbet, verse 22. And Moses led Israel onward from the Red Sea, really the Reed Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. They were marim. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And they had a problem. The waters were bitter. The people complained. Moses threw in a tree and fixed everything, and the waters got delicious again, okay? That word bitter, the Hebrew, marim, if you take away the vowels, it's the name Miriam, right? It's the name Miriam. She sings, and then after her song, they're in a place where they don't find water, okay? And the water that they finally find is bitter. Okay, let's keep going. Numbers 20, when Miriam passes away. And the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, came unto the wilderness of Tzin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Miriam's there, she's in Kadesh. And there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled against themselves, against Moses and against Aaron. Again, no water. Of course, this is why the rabbis associate the well with Miriam. It must be that as long as Miriam was around, they had water. And when she died, they didn't. The verses themselves, however, tell a different story, which is Miriam is associated with difficulties with water. Okay? What happens after that is in the next few verses, the people complain, we want water. God says, okay, you're going to talk to the rock. And in the end, in verse 10, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said unto them, Moses, hear now ye rebels. In Hebrew, do you know what the word rebels is rendered in Hebrew there? Ha-vi-morim. Please take away the vowels. And what do you see again? Miriam, okay? Hear ye the rebels, are we to bring water out from this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and smote the rock with his rod twice, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their cattle. I have to say that Moses lifting up his hand in the Hebrew, vayarem, is also from the same root as Miriam, okay? Not only that, but God gets very angry at Moses and Aaron for making this mistake and hitting the rock. And what does God say? And the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, because you believed not in me to sanctify me, lahakdisheni. Where was Miriam buried? Kadesh, right? To sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore ye shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. These are the waters of Merivah, which means fighting, where the children of Israel strove or fought with the Lord, and he was sanctified, Vayikadesh Bam, and he was sanctified in them. Now, this is not an original thought. You have to also remember, well, this is not an original thought. Dr. Devorah Steinmetz points this out in a wonderful article. Let's take a look at her citation here in number 5. In the biblical narrative, each mention of Miriam, with the exception of the story of her gossip, which we'll get to, is enveloped by the motif of water. In each story in which this motif appears, the nature of the water itself is ambiguous. The water causes good only by posing a threat. The river which drowns the infant boys allows Moses to be saved and to become the savior of his people. The sea which threatens the Israelites and drowns the Egyptians becomes the instrument of God's redemption. Bitter water becomes sweet. Water which makes impure also makes pure. And finally, the water which causes Moses' death nurtures the people, meaning because he hit the rock that caused his death. The ambiguity of this motif associated with Miriam seems to be reflected in 2 biblical wordplays on Miriam's name. Both appear in stories about the Israelites' lack of water, in the episodes of Marah, where they first hit the rock, where they first throw in the tree, and Merivah, where they hit the rock. Each of which follows a reference to Miriam. The word mar, bitter, occurs 4 times in one verse soon after Miriam's song, echoing and re-echoing a play on Miriam's name as Mar-yam, bitter sea or bitter water. Merivah means contentiousness and is linked in the episode which immediately follows Miriam's death with the word merry, rebelliousness. Both of these stories seem to be playing on Miriam's name. Together they offer the double connotation of bitterness and rebelliousness and suggest perhaps a complex view of Miriam consistent with the complexity of the water motif. I think this is a fascinating suggestion. The reason why I think this is a fascinating suggestion is because if I asked you, do you view Miriam as a character who takes initiative, or do you view Miriam as a character who follows directions? Takes initiative. Somebody who takes initiative, sometimes that's called moxie, and sometimes that gets you into trouble. So let's start with our first view of Miriam. Miriam watching to see if her brother is going to be okay in the Nile. Was she following someone's instructions when she did that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. She decides on her own, literally, and you have this in Exodus 2. I don't necessarily need to read the verses now because I want to make sure that we get to more meat, right? She decides on her own, as a 6-year-old, that she is going to stand by the water. Not only that, she decides on her own to walk up to the princess of the enslaving country to say, do you want me to find someone to nurse this child for you? This child has moxie. She takes initiative. She does not leave things as is. By the way, do you know who else has moxie and takes initiative? The Jewish people. When there is no water, they don't just sit there and say, okay, we'll wait for water. They ask. They argue. Sometimes it's too much, but sometimes it just shows that they're not just going to let things lie. That same trait sometimes can get Miriam into a little bit of trouble. Take a look at number 8, Numbers 12. And this brings us back to a difference between Moses and Miriam. In number 8, and Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. And of course, in the Hebrew, it's in the singular. She and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. for he had married a Cushite woman. And we don't know exactly what she was getting upset about. The Midrash, of course, connects her being upset with her original issue of family life, which is to say, back in the day when she was a little girl, the men and women separated, and Miriam was very upset about it, and she said this is totally inappropriate, because even if baby boys are going to be thrown into the sea, baby girls are going to live. So here too, what was she upset about? That Moses was not sleeping with his Cushite wife. She says it's not fair how he's treating his wife, right? So the Midrash connects them. But all we have from the text, and they said, hath the Lord indeed spoken only with Moses? Hath he not spoken only with us? And the Lord also with us? And the Lord heard it. What's their complaint? Why does Moses keep himself so separate? Why does he think he's so special? We're the same, right? It's that same sense of A, initiative, but B, the being part of the people. You know who else made that argument, but not in the same kind of tone? Korach made that argument. Everybody is holy. Why are you only holy? Everybody is holy, right? There's something of the people. Back to that Miriam who has that song of the sea that's able to rally the people and get them together. And she knows what they want because that's her. That's her personality. She relates to that. She takes that initiative. She doesn't leave well enough alone. And sometimes that gets her in trouble. And sometimes that makes her the heroine, right? She uses her character traits, sometimes for good, and sometimes it's too much, depending on the situation, right? Now that's a different type of leadership, which is somebody who recognizes their own propensity for a thing, uses it in service of their people, and even though sometimes it gets them in trouble, we forgive them because we know that they use it mostly in the service of their people, right? It's a very different model. And of course, the next verse reminds us how separate Moses was from everybody, not because he wanted to be separate from them, but just because he by nature, that's him. That's him. Okay? And now the man Moses was very meek above all the men who were upon the face of the earth. Right? If you had any question about who Moses belongs, he belongs by himself. He's alone. Right? That doesn't mean something bad about Moses, and it doesn't mean something bad about Miriam. What it means is that we have at least two different leadership styles here, right? And sometimes you need one, and sometimes you need the other. Sometimes you need a mix, which is kind of impossible to do in one person. If you want to play with the names more, we can play with the names, right? His name is Moses, Kimin Hamayim Mishitiu, because I've drawn him from the water. He gets drawn, right? He gets told what to do, and he does it. She's not like that. She is her own storm, okay? She brings her own thunder, which is a very unique, she's loud, she has the music, she's a, right? But Moses can stand on the mountain, right? And Moses has the discipline that's required for that. So there are two really interesting perspectives. Now, of course, I was not looking for this. First of all, well, I should say, before I even go there. No, let's start with that. I was not looking for this. I didn't want to find the male character being, the separate Roman and the female character being with me. I wasn't looking for that. I don't really roll that way. That's not really my perspective. But that's what I found. And I found it to be rather interesting that seemed to be the case. And that you have these two really important figures who really envelop the story, right? Meaning you have from the water at the beginning, those two people are the ones who stand out. And then the water at the end, when they cross the sea and they realize, wow, it's over, we did it in some way, that these two people are there, right? There's something to that you have both of those models there. And by the way, there's also something ironic that at the beginning, she's the one who's watching to make sure he's going to be okay. And at the end, she follows his lead. Even as she does it differently, but she follows his lead. She's accepted that he's in the front, right? So there's a lot that can be said about this. But the reason why I say I didn't want to find the gender stereotypes, because I really didn't. But beyond that, I said to myself, well, if we're going to do a class that's essentially going to reinforce that, I need to show you something else that's going to upend that a little bit, okay? That's not necessarily about leadership, but just a really kind of fascinating piece that has come up. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. If you look on page 5, I wanted to show it to you. As we're sort of turning to page 5, just to give you a little bit more background to take home with you, the discussion of why Moses is not in the Haggadah, right? Lots of wonderful answers have been given. Some suggest that it's actually an anti-Christian polemic. They wanted to make sure that there was no human intercessor who ended up being sort of the front man for this story, especially as Passover and Easter have important seasonal connections. Some people suggest, actually, Aaron Waldowski, who's a political philosopher, suggests that this is actually Moses' way of modeling that every person should have their own voice at the Passover Seder. I think what we've seen of Moses is kind of interesting because if Moses is separate, then sort of by definition, people have their own voices at the same time as they're following this really sort of elevated leader. It's funny that people don't ask the question of why Miriam and Aaron aren't there. And I think that also speaks to the kind of leadership that at least we've seen on Miriam's part, which is, well, no, we don't need to point her out. She's part of us, which I think is just an interesting thing to think about. The other thing also is the question, and this is a question that has come up over the ages, is a question that is first posed in the Talmud, or it's not really posed as a question in the Talmud. Maimonides turns it into a question, but a passage in the Talmud that says, you know, is it really more virtuous to want to do bad and to overcome your inclination, or is it better to not even want to do those bad things in the first place? And I think we're playing a little bit on that, and then Maimonides essentially turned that into a big philosophical question and said, well, for things that are obviously terrible, it would be better if you didn't want to do them in the first place. But for things that are, you know, a little bit more maybe ritual, innovative, not things that naturally people would think are bad. So Maimonides says in his introduction, the 6th chapter of his introduction to Ethics of Our Ancestors, which some people call Ethics of Our Fathers, he suggests that is, you know, that's sort of the difference. But I think these two characters are playing on that question also, Moses and Miriam. So just to sort of leave you off with a little bit of laughs or this sort of gender stereotyping and what do we do with it, on page 5, I just want you to look. These are different Haggadah illustrated manuscripts, which, by the way, if you don't have any other Haggadahs other than the Haggadah that you bring to the table, I highly, highly recommend even going online and looking for different Haggadah images from around the world. It's just magnificent. I remember when Sotheby's had that exhibit on Judaica a few years back, somebody took me and said, oh, Elana, you have to see XYZ that's in that room. You have to see. I said, of all the things that are in all of these rooms, I wonder what you're going to show me. And he brought me over to a Haggadah, and he says, see, they have the same wine stains as we do. And I said, that was so worth it, first of all, for the retelling power of it. But second of all, it's absolutely true. The idea of being able to relate to Jews from around the world and around the ages who have done the same thing as in their own ways, but the same thing as we're going to do on that wonderful evening. So that's why I just love looking at Haggadahs from around the world and from history. So here are a few illuminated manuscripts. I want you to see this. All 4 of these, okay, are on the page that is supposed to say maror zeh, this bitter herb. Okay, can you tell me what you see going on in any of the pictures? Some of them are easier to tell than others. Okay, so you have male and female in every picture. Great, you have male and female in every picture. Ah, okay, interesting. You say the man has his hand on the woman in one of them, right? The second one in the middle. In 2 of them, right? You're right, on the left too as well. Good point. She's holding a sword, which is interesting. Okay, the bottom picture and the top picture.
She's telling him something and he's protesting.
Well, so interesting, right? There's pointing, because you see there's pointing actually. In the bottom one, they're both pointing. The top one, she's pointing, okay? So, oh, you think he's pointing in the top one as well? Right, so the bottom one, it seems that exactly. The bottom one, they're both pointing at each other. So this is the Jewish joke. You know, when my husband and I got married, everybody thought that they could tell us, give us like Jewish wisdom about marriage, but it would always end up being, oh my gosh, getting married is like, I've been married for 50 years, but it feels like I've only been married for 2 days, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. That's what everybody, literally, like, that's what people tell us. We're like, are we supposed to be happy about getting married or never eat again? What are you trying to tell us exactly? But this has been used, some of these illustrations, especially the bottom one, because people never notice that she's pointing. The bottom one has been used that they're telling each other that they're maror, they're bitter. They're pointing at each other and saying, maror zed, this bitter, you, blah. Sounds like a great Passover Seder from the most dysfunctional family ever, right? So I want to read this little pink space, this peach space on the bottom. There has been much discussion about these images, which at first glance show a man pointing to his wife saying, maror zeh, this bitter herb, indicating that she is a source of bitterness. Perhaps some artists use this as an opportunity to inject, and I love this, what they felt was humor. However, a careful examination of the images tells another story. If one looks carefully at the image of Hilek and the Bilik Haggadah, which I think the bottom one will note that the husband and wife are pointing at each other. In the Washington Haggadah, while the husband points to the wife holds a sword, right? So the middle left. So it says he's pointing to her. I actually think his hand is on her head as opposed to pointing to her, which is a very unusual item for a medieval woman to handle. Clearly, there's more imagery on display here. The Haggadah at this point is discussing the hard work to which the Jewish people were subjected in Egypt, which was considered bitter and therefore represented by maror, by bitter herbs. The word the Torah uses to describe this word is farech. The Aggadic homiletical interpretation of farech, work, is that men were given women's work and vice versa. If so, the pointing may be to indicate that the husband was forced to do his wife's work and the wife the husband's work. This would explain why in the Hilek and Bilik Haggadah, the wife also points to the husband. Similarly, in the Washington Haggadah, the wife holding the sword would indicate that she is doing man's work, which is symbolized by the sword. I just thought that was an interesting thing to bring to your attention in the sense of, how gender plays into the Passover Seder. We all, you see it with the 4 children versus the 4 sons, right? You see it, the cup of Miriam, the orange on the Seder plate, how gender plays into the Haggadah. But I think it's very interesting to think about how gender plays into the slavery itself and the salvation ultimately, which is something that I think we sort of touched the liminal pieces of today. I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful Passover and lots to talk about at your Seder. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.